Hello students, this morning we shall discuss the topic explanations of crime or criminality. This is a topic on substantive criminal law, and I am Professor B.B. Pandey, former professor of University of Delhi and presently the chair professor of criminal law at the National Law University, Delhi. Explanations of crime and criminality has every instance of crime has a normative character. Source of norm may be social mood or legal edict. The change in the norms relating to deviance or crime may be a product of multiple factors such as the impact of science and technology, expanding horizons of knowledge, dominant political ideology, etc. The learning objectives of this lecture are to appreciate the multiple ways in which crime can be explained, to learn about changing criminological explanations. Third, to explore the reasons of diverse explanations. Fourth, to assess the extent to which the explanations influence the formal criminalizations and criminal policy, to evaluate how the diverse explanations have impacted the thinking on punishment. Now, with these learning objectives, I move over to the core explanations of crime and deviance in the criminological thinking. The criminological thinking can be divided into four major sectors. The first is pre-classical thinking about crime. The pre-classical explanations of crime in the primitive societies were associated with myth and supernaturalism, where crime was mixed up with demonology and totemism. A criminal was considered to be a person who was devil incarnate, a person who was inspired by demonological instincts, and there was a close association between religion and supernaturalism in those periods. The thinking about crime influenced not only the conceptualization of crime, but also the forms of investigation of crime and the punishments also. In those eras, there were severe and draconic punishments. Even in Great Britain, in the 1726 Act, as many as 212 offences were punishable with death sentence, because the sentences were disproportionate, and criminal law was there was a kind of justification for elimination of every person who showed any kind of streak of criminality. Now, in that era, ordeals grew, punishment of draconian nature grew, ordeal by hot water ordeals, ordeals of drowning, ordeals of Agni Pariksha, and all those concepts were primitive society concepts to prove whether a person is a criminal or not. The proof also was based on supernaturalism and myths. Even punishments were given which were disproportionate, and they were given to both animate and inanimate objects, like a bullock cart would be burnt, a bullock was to be killed who trampled a person under its feet. Therefore, the concept was, and these concepts come back now and then in our society, where we hear even today a truck which the strikes down or kills children or mows a man, the truck is burned down by the mob, by the crowd. We see truck as the criminal and we burn it down because we have in our back of the mind there is a supernatural explanation of criminality being attributed to a truck. Therefore, this kind of thinking about crime was definitely a mystical thinking about crime, and where no theorization was possible. There was a close association between religion and supernaturalists in the investigation of crime and deployment of ordeals. Even punishments were influenced by supernaturalism, and punishments were inflicted like on horses, bulls that trampled or gored a man to death. This state of criminal law or criminological thinking was taken over in the end of the 18th century by 1773-74. Beccaria, Montesquieu, their ideas came, and they saw that crime is a this worldly phenomena, not an otherworldly phenomena, and therefore a criminal is to be treated as a person who is committing crime because of his free will, and every criminal was considered to be attributed to have a free will, and and he broke the law. Law was considered to be a freely chosen contract, and that was broken when a criminal committed a crime, and he deserved to be punished. And the classicalists were very strong supporter that state is under an obligation to punish all persons who are criminals, because but the punishment should be based on the utility. That the essential classicalist thinking about crime were the following: that first, every crime or deviation was crime was considered to be a freely chosen contract was the criteria of crime. Classicalists propounded for the first time that every crime is a freely willed human conduct and not a otherworldly conduct. This made classicalism a kind of a great march over the earlier pre-classicalist thinking, because their crime was considered to be a otherworldly phenomena. The classicalists were the first criminological explanators of crime being a this worldly phenomena. Crime is a freely willed human conduct. Now, for the classicalists, the legal system was a system of freely chosen contracts between men and the liberal society. They propagated a broader theory of social control of every person who seems to have deviated from the norms of the society. The essentials of classicalist thinking about crime were the following. First, the manner in which a state would react to criminals. Second, describing all the law-breaking behavior as essentially pathological or irrational. According to classicalists, appropriateness of all punishment ought to be weighed in terms of hedonistic calculus. Hedonistic calculus was an idea which was introduced by classicalists that premised on the thinking that every criminal derives pleasure out of commission of crime, and if punishment is just enough to increase pain so that the criminal will not indulge in a criminal behavior to derive pleasure out of the activity, he will desist from the crime. But at the same time, the fourth important classicalist thinking was that every punishment must be tested in the touchstone of utility, that punishment should give greatest happiness to greatest number. That showed that classicalists were essentially utilitarians in character. They wanted every punishment to be tested in such tone of utility. The third, the science in the late 18th and 19th century had been influencing all social sciences, and even criminology could not remain untouched by pure scientific method. And pure scientific method led to positivist thinking, starting with the Lombroso was the first pure scientist, positivist, who explained crimes in terms of biological determinism. Crime is a determined phenomena and not freely willed human conduct. The positivists differed from classicalists in one major respect, and that was crime is not a freely willed phenomena alone. Every crime is a determined phenomena. There was a kind of free will versus determinism between classicalist and positivist. It was free will conceptualization of crime not only provided a strong and multifaceted explanation for crime in the 18th century, but also tends to provide the most satisfactory rational justification even today. The positivists propounded a view that crime is determined and not freely willed. The determinism of crime was on account of factors that lay beyond the free will of the criminal, either in his biology or in his psyche or in his environment. The psychological determinists treated every crime as a consequence of psychological factors. The sociological determinists treated every crime as a consequence of psychological factors. Therefore, the positivists made a clear-cut departure from classicalist line of thinking. They said crime is determined, and determinism became a new criteria for explaining criminality. The positivists propounded a new view that crime is determined, not freely willed. The determinism of crime was on account of factors that lay beyond the free will of the criminal, either in his biology or in his psyche or in his environment, leading to the school of biological determinism, the school of psychological determinism, the school of environmental determinism. And psychological determinists treated every crime as a consequence of psychological factors. Sociological determinists treated every crime as a consequence of sociological factors. Therefore, these determinists brought a kind of element of scientific determinism in the field of criminological explanations of crime and criminality. Now, the positivists were themselves divided into liberal positivists of crime and radical positivists of crime. Now, liberal positivists of crime agreed that legal system reflects the freely chosen contracts between rational man and liberal state. They strive to develop a moral yardstick built on positive scientific lines for the diminution of unwanted behavior that is based on assumption that there exists a social and moral consensus in the society. As against this, the radical positivist position on crime is the reduction of criminality is affected by unscientific ways in which the rule-breaking individuals are handled by the police, judges, and the correctional officials. The three major points of departure for evolving a different moral calculus independent of law was suggested by radical positivists, and the 3 points of departure were: first, there exists certain fundamental human sentiments, violation of which indicates the presence of real crime. Second, it may be possible to specify a consensus which could be quite distinct from the edicts of legal system. Now, the liberal positivist view of crime, the positivist thinking about crime and criminality is divided into two categories. One, that of liberal positivist view of crime. The liberal positivists agree that the legal system reflects the freely chosen contracts between rational man and liberal state. They strive to develop a moral yardstick built on positive scientific lines for the diminution of unwanted behavior that is based on assumptions that there exists a social and moral consensus in the society. The radical positivists, on the contrary, say that reduction of criminality is affected by the unscientific way in which the rule breaking individuals are handled by the police, the judges and the correctional officials. The three major points of departure for evolving a moral calculus independent of law propounded by radical positivists are: first, there exists certain fundamental human sentiment, violation of which indicates the presence of real crime. Second, it may be possible to specify a consensus which could be quite distinct from the edicts of the legal system. Third, it is possible to make appeal to certain real system needs against which the acts or the law are really dysfunctional. Now, the fourth major thinking about crime and criminological explanation of crime is given by radical thinking about crime and criminality. The radical thinkers radical view emerged in the 1960s that came as a challenge to the hegemony of both classicalism and positivism. In this sense, that both classicalism and positivism were either looking to the crime phenomena or to the criminal, his factors that influence his behavior, but they were accepting the system as non-problematic. As against this, the radicals, Professor Wolfgang had said in 1942, one of his writings, that we have looked long enough to the crime or the criminal, but it is time for us to look to the rotting criminal justice system, the system by which crime is defined and the system by which the criminals are handled. Therefore, they shifted the focus from crime and criminal to the criminal justice system. The radical thinking about crime and criminality can be categorized into two main streams: the interactionist or the labeling theory stream. Crime is merely a label that people in dominant position are able to attach on someone who is in an inferior position. The second radical stream was critical theorists or Marxist stream. They believe the causes of crime to be rooted in the economic, social and political fabric of the society and can be tackled only by effecting major changes in the fabric. As against these four major criminological explanations, there is a fifth, and which is the dominant one, the authoritative version of duly enacted crime. Duly enacted crime says crime is a harmful human conduct that sovereign desires to prevent by infliction of punishment. Crime requires that it should be an outcome of exercise of political sovereign's legislative power. Therefore, if the legislature is free, the sovereign is free to make crimes. The instances are like SC and ST, Atrocities Prevention Act of 1989, the POCSO Act of 2012, the Indian Penal Code, under which diverse categories of crimes are lumped together, and the Indian Penal Code happens to be of 1860 vintage. Professor Andrew Ashworth describes the principle of core of criminal law as Professor Andrew Ashworth was very critical of the way in which over criminalization is rampant in UK, and crimes have been made without keeping in mind the core principles of criminal law. And he identified the 4 core principles: censor persons for substantial wrongdoing. For small wrongdoings, criminal law use is not desirable. He said punishment must be given proportionate to the seriousness of the wrongdoing. Disproportionate punishment, according to him, was a violation of core principle of criminal law. The third was wrongdoers should be afforded due process protections, and they should not be, if they are to be subjected to criminal law, they should not be subjected to without due process protections. And finally, the fourth point, core principle of criminal law, dished out by Professor Andrew Ashworth, is there should be equal treatment and proportionality between processes of criminal law. Therefore, if they are not there, now explanations of crime and its relationship with punishment. Now this is very important, that since criminal behavior, being freely willed, is assumed to be delivering pleasure to the wrongdoer, the state becomes justified in the infliction of pain of punishment. 2 distinct approaches of punishments are the just desert approach, the therapeutic or treatment approach. Now the just desert approach to punishment assumes 3 things. Every punishment must fit the crime or the legal infraction. The second, the same punishment must be inflicted for similar crimes. And the third, nature of crime and frequency of criminals' involvement ought to be the sole basis for the quantum of punishment. Now the therapeutic approach, on the contrary, says that punishment is to be given as a measure of individualization. Therefore, individualization of punishment is the sine qua non of every punishment. As a measure of therapy, punishment may be justified on account of retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and reform of the wrongdoer. The third component of therapeutic approach is act of punishment should be addressed to the needs of each wrongdoer, which could be repressive and harsh, and soft and reform oriented on the other end. Fourth, pure treatment oriented model of punishment lies at the foundation of juvenile justice system throughout the world. And fifth therapeutic approach component is the correctional approach and compromise of techniques such as mediation or reconciliation, etc., has evolved from therapeutic approach itself. Therefore, therapeutic approach is with lot more possibilities and lot more unexhausted implications. Now we come to the conclusion. We have discussed in this paper so far various criminological explanations, why crimes are explained in different historical period differently. Different ideological ideas have been weaved in the explanation of crime and criminality in different historical periods. Various criminological explanations of crime and criminality affects the criminal policy and their consequent changes on the norms relating to crime and criminalization itself. The explanation of crime and criminality not only helps to identify the multiple ways in which crime can be explained. The third conclusion is that the diverse explanations also impact the thinking on punishment and suggests ways and means of punitive reforms themselves. Therefore, this is a very important area for learning for the listeners and students. Thank you.